Africa is not typically known by the mainstream for extraterrestrial reports, but it is certainly ground zero for some of the strangest. It was 1994. It began as a calm, peaceful day at a school in a small rural farming community. 62 of the school children, ranging in age from 5 to 12 years old and of mixed ethnic heritage, were out playing in the playground during their break time as their teachers had a school meeting indoors. The air was filled with laughter and merriment, and it was meant to be a seemingly normal day at school. But this was soon to change to gasps of alarm when something very strange materialized out of the unknown. What would transpire next would become one of the most interesting paranormal encounters to come out of the continent of Africa, and which some people would believe has never really been satisfactorily explained. And very soon, the school children who witnessed this phenomenon would gather to share their story about a sighting that had happened in a field next to that playground. Almost or over 30 years later, their unique but consistent story would prove to be one of the most believable sightings of the paranormal that had been witnessed in Africa, even with the lack of physical evidence.
Hundreds of people today phoned the ZBC saying they sighted an unidentified flying object.
I've never seen anything like it in my life.
It was the absence of noise I didn't like.
People from all over Zimbabwe were phoning the BBC to say, we've seen something weird. Ariel School, 19th September 94. Could you tell me what you saw on Friday?
The silver thing in amongst this clump of trees.
We saw this black figure running.
His face was like this and his eyes were down here.
I just thought it was some kind of alien from a different planet.
Rua is a small agricultural center located 22 kilometers southeast of Harare, which is the capital and largest city in Zimbabwe. At the time, it was not a town but only just a local place associated with farming. Within Rua was the Ariel School, which was an expensive private school. Most of the people who were at the school during the 90s were from wealthy or middle-class white families who lived in Harare. It was 10 a.m. on September 16, 1994 in Ariel School, a school with around, if not more than 350 pupils. The students were outside during the mid-morning break. During the break, the adult faculty at the school, mostly the teachers, head teachers and the headmaster, and other senior members were inside having a short meeting at the time. Moments later, during and following the break, some of the students would quickly rush into the classroom areas, with some of them panicking. When the school children returned to class, many of them would begin to tell the teachers about what they had seen, and soon it began to spread among other teachers, then throughout the school. After the school authorities heard what these young children were saying, at first, many of them, if not all of them, couldn't believe it, and with no physical proof, when they had gone over to check for themselves, the adults had to dismiss all of them. However, when many of these young school kids returned home, they obviously continued to tell their parents exactly what they had told their teacher. The next day, being the 17th of September 1994, many of those parents would come to the school to discuss with the school authorities the stories they had heard from their children. In fact, what the school children claimed they saw happen, which was later dubbed by the media as, in quotes, the Ariel School UFO incident, would become a very big deal, as the story would be reported around the world, and the BBC crew would be the first to arrive on the scene few days after the story had gone viral. The more widespread this story went, the more people who heard it, including the skeptics, who would begin to question the validity of this strange story, which seemed too incredible. For some, these school children were just lying, or maybe it was just a hoax. And so, before I tell you an actual personal account of one of the stories of what happened at Ariel School that morning, what was gathered from various evidence from the interview, descriptions, photos and various drawings which were all gotten from the media and from these kids when they were separately interviewed would likely determine if you believe this story or not. This will determine if you really believed what they saw and if they were telling the truth, especially given the fact that 2 days prior to the incident at Ariel School, there had been several unidentified flying object sightings throughout Southern Africa, where there had been numerous reports of a bright fireball passing through the sky at night. There were also reports of strange lights and a craft in the sky in other parts of Zimbabwe, as well as in Zambia and South Africa. During that period, many people answered ZBC's radio's request to call in and describe what they had seen. Although some witnesses interpreted the fireball as a comet or meteor, it resulted in a wave of UFO mania in Zimbabwe at the time, in what was termed a mass hysteria till the area school UFO incident occurred. After the incident, the BBC crew and the Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard psychiatrist, a man by the name of Dr. John Mark, would travel to the school to interview the children and record the extraordinary accounts of their stories. Emily Trim was a student at the area primary school near the town of Ruwa in Zimbabwe. In an incident which as a grown-up she says still affects her to this day, on that fateful morning, she was playing a game with a friend of hers named Lisa, where they would hop on the boundary logs around the playground. It would be a few moments later, when in a field about 300 feet away from their playground, they both heard a high-pitched frequency sound, followed by a flash of light, then followed by a disc-shaped craft suddenly appearing in their line of sight while hovering on air, like some sort of teleportation we see in movies when you think of it. One of these silver flying objects, which looked like a spacecraft, was bigger and would make a landing, while many of the same flying objects, which were smaller, remained in the air while hovering around the bigger shiny object. And in these spacecrafts were various displays of colors being projected underneath them. Emily would later say it was hard to judge time at this point, especially how long the whole incident lasted, from the moment the craft and humanoid beings appeared till they finally left, although the school would later give an estimate of 15 minutes or thereabouts. But on that day, Emily clearly remembered they were away from the field when she saw those unidentifiable flying shiny objects hovering on air before one of it landed in a field near the school and strange beings began to exit the craft, while two of the strange beings started hopping on the logs next to them as if to mimic them. These beings were described to be about 3 feet in height, with a long neck, narrow face, long black hair, and rugby-sized eyeballs coming out from the top of the orb, and then suddenly they ended up about 5 feet in front of them and began to interact with them. However, they seemed curious and weren't touching the ground beneath them. Suddenly, the girls were frozen and started receiving images which as adults now, while speaking, they say seemed like mental telepathy, as telepathic images were being communicated to them from the strange beings' eyes. According to Emily, the message of the images was about the positives and negatives of technology, as the beings were telling her that there was a good and a bad way to use technology, and that humans can do better. This was the message given to her by the strange beings. Emily believed the beings were giving them messages as they maintained eye contact. It was just image after image after image, but once she broke eye contact, those exchange of messages seemed to just vanish. One of the other girls standing beside her would also be communicated to by these beings, and the messages she received, she later stated, was more of communication about the environment and for humans to protect the environment they live in. When the information had been passed, for many of the children, especially the younger ones, the astonishment and awe was turning to outright fear, and some of them began crying and screaming as these otherworldly beings frolicked and cavorted about the premises. The creatures then apparently just vanished into thin air, after which the craft rose above the trees and shot off into the distance to leave them awestruck. After this encounter, the children then ran back to the school in a panic and explained the bizarre series of events to the adults, who were at first apprehensive and skeptical about it all, as there was no adult present to observe the unidentified objects or beings during that moment, possibly because it might have vanished by the time the school teachers arrived at the scene during the commotion. To further get a picture of what these kids were describing in words, the children were then asked by the school authorities to separately draw pictures of what they had seen, and these were various pictures they had done describing what they had seen. Spookily, what was depicted on paper was eerily the same across the board, as similar drawings were presented by the school kids. It It was at this point that the adults began to believe that perhaps something really unexplainable had happened in that rural schoolyard, and that it was not merely the imaginations of a bunch of scared kids. Researchers from BBC and some crew members who had traveled to the school after the incident would also ask the kids to draw what they had seen while it was still fresh in their minds. Some of these pictures showed various disc-shaped figures of what seemed like a sophisticated aircraft just behind the tree line, while some were still suspended mid-air. Each drawing was according to their level of capability and the angle of the object they had seen. Some of the children would also draw a photo to describe the humanoid figures they had seen, which they said were all dressed in tight black clothing with eyes 4 to 5 times larger the size of that of humans, and with these bigger eyes just resting much below the forehead when compared to that of a human. They would also describe them as having very little to non-existent nose and very small mouth opening when compared to the likes of us. I will generally describe or give a summary of the accounts of what the majority of the rest of the students said at first, before I continue with the rest of the subsequent events following this encounter. They described how there was allegedly a bright flash in the sky, and when the children looked up in bafflement, approaching the school were 3 to 4 silvery disc-like objects with what appeared to be lit portals around their edges. These mysterious objects reportedly would vanish and reappear some distance away several times, suggesting that they were either moving very fast or teleporting. It wouldn't be long before one of the objects began to descend, following some electrical lines towards a brush-soaked patch of overgrown feral land adjacent to the school grounds, where it aerially descended to disappear behind the gnarled trees and tangled underbrush. At this point, the kids were enthralled by what they were seeing, and one of the witnesses would later say of the object. This thing, whatever it was beautiful. It had a circular-shaped bright light as the leader, and behind it were tails of light in beautiful colors: green, orange, and yellow. It moved slowly and looked as if it was just above the house. The amazing thing is that it moved absolutely silently. It was later determined that the area into which the craft had come down in was off limits to the children, fenced off because it was deemed to be too dangerous. But they pressed as close as they could to this tangle of undergrowth and this barrier to peer within, and they saw only about 100 yards away the mysterious object. It was described as either sitting upon the gnarled weeds or hovering slightly over them, and at this point, it still generated amazement for the school kids. Yet, this would change into alarm when the craft seemed to open to disgorge 2 strange beings, which were described as very thin, frail, even, with slender neck and very large outsized almond-shaped slanting black bug eyes, and dressed in tight-fitting shiny black and silver one-piece suits of some sort. Both creatures were moving back and forth on the bushy ground. It looked like they were bouncing, said one student. Moreover, the children believed that the strange-looking creatures were just looking at them almost mockingly. The students also explained that they were scared because they hadn't seen any person similar to the creatures before this encounter in their own lives. Some witnesses would say that the entities also possessed long straight black hair upon their heads. The enigmatic beings silently approached the children, with some like Emily and her friend reportedly having received telepathic contact during the encounter. 4 days later, which was on the Tuesday, 20th of September 1994, while the class of more than 60 school children were being interviewed in different groups at the area school in Rua, they would once again, one after the other, describe how they saw a maroon or silver disc-shaped craft land in a field behind their playground on that fateful bright morning of Friday, the 16th of September 1994, while restating that humanoids emerged from the craft. During the interview, Emily began painting and drawing mysterious and beautiful images which she felt were a manifestation of the messages she received from the strange beings from the craft, which she had seen some days ago. The rest of the students would also claim they saw the same sight as her when they saw her drawing. Some of them would also describe how one of these black humanoids that emerged from the craft was running in slow motion from one end to another in a confused manner, while another was on the craft and seemed to be guiding it or just looking out. 2 months later, following the event, which was on November 1994, Dr. Jean-Marc, who was the head of the Harvard Department of Psychiatry as of then, would travel all the way from the United States to Roa School in Zimbabwe. He would organize an interview with the area school headmaster, Colin McKay, to talk with the children and to get to learn more from them on what they had actually witnessed and get every bit information from them on what they had allegedly seen on that fateful day. On arrival at the school, he would meet with the rest of the adult faculty in the school and would effectively begin the interview with a series of interesting questions which followed various strange answers and descriptions, still coming from these pupils. Shortly after Dr. John Mark and one of the local UFO researchers by the name of Hind had done interviewing many of the 62 children at length and perusing the sketches the children had made, they were both impressed with the calm sincerity with which these children told their stories. They came to the distinct conclusion that the kids at least truly believed that this had all happened and that they were reliable witnesses, made even more remarkable due to the fact that many of these rural children had never even heard of UFOs before. He would become convinced that they were telling the truth, and he would say, "The children experienced a very powerful encounter with these beings, and we are left with a rather disturbing fact that this seems to be what it is, and it seems to have no other psychiatric explanation. I would never say yes, there are aliens taking people, but I would say there is a compelling, powerful phenomenon here that I can't account for in any other way. Yet, I can't know what it is, but it seems to me that it invites a deeper, further inquiry." You see, for little children in a rural area who had no knowledge of UFOs or aliens, or who had never seen what an extraterrestrial looks like, for them to paint a picture or put in drawing what they had seen and which seemed eerily similar is something to really think about. The versions of stories and drawings from these children seemed so familiar, including the descriptions of the aircraft and the humanoid figures. Dr. John Mark knew there was no way these children could make up what they had seen, as everyone continued to stick to their stories, even though some people who heard the story continued to dismiss the story as false. 1.5 years later, after the area school UFO incident, which was on March 1996, the pupils who had witnessed the events of 1994 would be called together and sat under a tree branch so as to document and solidify one more time what they had seen and heard, and to tell their story again. During this gathering, they would still stick to their stories as the journalists got to interact with them and to see if what they had saw was still fresh with them. This subsequent retelling would focus on the children's account of 4 aircraft hovering and landing at the far end of the schoolyard, strange beings emerging and then telepathically communicating with them. Following this story, the Ariel incident would come to be one of the most prized UFO cases among researchers at the time, who say that the scores of witnesses, their contemporaneous accounts, and even striking drawings of the alleged craft and beings make for a very compelling and unsettling story. Following the area school UFO incident, the event that took place would become the focus of a movie documentary produced in 2020 known as The Phenomenon, and it would also become the main focus of a new 2022 documentary known as The Ariel Phenomenon. A documentary meant for the now grown-up adults who had witnessed the strange phenomenon almost or over 30 years ago as little kids to tell their story without any sort of fear or criticism from the public. It would also later turn out that Dr. John's remark following his belief in the children's account would prove to be remarkable, as he was a highly respected psychiatrist at the top of his field. But this would prove to have been detrimental to his career, as his peers, who did not share his view that this was a real UFO event, were not on board with his ideas. Indeed, others in the psychiatric field looked upon the whole thing with raised eyebrows at best and sheer scorn at worst, with one of the medical personnel from Johns Hopkins Medical School calling Mark a brilliant fellow who occasionally loses it, and would say he lost it big time following his belief in what the kids had seen. Also, it probably didn't help that Mark had written a book on alien abductions called Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens, which had also somewhat said to have tarnished his credibility among his peers and caused him to be labeled as a bit out there. It got to the point that Mark was actually investigated by a committee looking into whether he was actually fit to provide clinical care and investigation for these people. The first time a tenured Harvard professor had ever been subjected to such an inquiry. Mark would set off the letter he received from the dean informing him of this. One of the deans at the Harvard Medical School handed me a letter that called for the establishment of a small committee to investigate my work on the alien abduction phenomenon. After explaining vaguely that concerns had been expressed to the university about what I was doing, although he told of no specific complaints nor was any offered in the letter, He added pleasantly, for he had been a friend and colleague, that I would not have gotten into trouble if I had not suggested in the book that my findings might require a change in our view of reality, rather than saying that I had found a new psychiatric syndrome whose cause had not yet been established. However, following the investigation, Mark would later be found by the dean to be clear and free to study what he wishes and to state his opinions without impediment. But sadly, he would die on the 27th of September 2004 after being hit by a drunk driver in London. But his work lives on and remains some of the best and deepest ever done into the area school UFO encounter. In 2007, a filmmaker by the name of Randall Nickerson would travel to Zimbabwe to make a documentary of the incident, interviewing witnesses further and sort of carrying on the torch from Mark's work. Yet, it has still become a mostly rather obscure and forgotten case. Okay, wait, I'm not done yet. Remember at the start of this story when I mentioned that one element that had been lacking in the accounts of these school children was the physical evidence of the landing. However, to further support and confirm that these children might have actually been telling the truth, another crucial pieces of evidence which had been hidden from the public for a long time would come to light. It would be May 2022 when never-before seen photos would reveal extraordinary impressions that had been left in that grass field, possibly by UFOs during the famous 1994 sighting, which was witnessed by more than 60 of these school children in Zimbabwe. Well, I purposely left out this crucial piece of information and evidence till now for a reason: to save the best for the last. A BBC man in Zimbabwe, a journalist by the name of Tim Leish, had alerted another man who was a photographer to the incident the day it occurred. You see, 4 days after the area school UFO sighting, one of the first people to arrive on the scene was the said photographer, a young man by the name of Gunter Hoffer. Gunter would arrive at the school, and 2 of the pupils would take him and the crew around the grounds, beyond the playground where the unidentified flying crafts were seen. When Gunter was on the scene to document what had happened, he would walk to the particular spot or area in the field where the school kids had said they had seen the bigger silver disc-shaped craft make a landing. Initially, he couldn't find anything in the area where many of the kids had seen a craft that Friday. But then, he would make a very notable discovery. During the BBC interview, some of the children had also described seeing a craft in a separate location on the field, which was by another end of that field. It was at that moment that Gunter would realize from the unique accounts given by some of these school children that some of them had indeed also seen UFOs the previous day on the other end of the field, which was on Thursday, the 15th of September 1994. The crew had noticed that some of the kids drew 2 objects with different shapes. One object looked like a cigar, and they labeled that as Thursday, and then they drew what they saw on Friday, the 16th of September 1994, which looked more like a disc-like oval-shaped object, which a student had described as resembling 2 plates put together. Both boys had also told Gunter that on Thursday, which was the 15th of September 1994, that they had seen a craft with flashing lights flying above the power lines at the other end of the playground. It was moving, disappeared, then instantly reappeared somewhere else, and then suddenly vanished, one of them said. This meant that some of the children had seen UFOs on 2 different days. A map of area school would illustrate the 2 landing sites where the UFOs were said to have touched down on 2 consecutive days in September 1994. The site of the supposed second landing on Friday, September 16, 1994, Hoffer would explain that he didn't find any evidence of a landing in that area where the ground, according to him, was already flat. There was no grass and the surface was hard. And almost all over 30 years later, Gunter would share his own experiences from the photo evidence he took in Zimbabwe and what he heard from some of these students. And this was what he had to say.
So a couple of days later, when I came in, I took the opportunity to go and see the other parts of the ground to see if I could find anything else. But it was, a lot of grass that end. And I found over this side 2 oval shapes, one small oval and one larger oval. The larger one crossed over a path, so it was kind of had a division through that path. and a small one was in there. And I remember seeing that there was a slight swirl to the oval, to both ovals. I also found like what looked like a wedge-shaped marking in the ground, something had pushed in.
At the other end of the field, where the craft had suddenly vanished, would Gunter find two oval shapes and a wedge-shaped marking that had indeed flattened the ground around. Gunter would remember that on that day, the earth around there was rock solid due to the long drought in Zimbabwe during that time in the 90s. And according to him, whatever made that mark really dug in hard, possibly to support something, which in this case was suspected to be the weight of the craft. The area where the two oval impressions were spotted was inaccessible to vehicles. Although cattle could access the area, the largest shape was about 30 feet long, and there were no imprints to suggest cows walking through. Hoffa would later admit that while he and Tim Leish were interviewing the boys, they were distracted by a bright light shining from the nearby hills. He would also say, "On top of a nearby hill, we saw an extremely bright, intense light, like someone was reflecting sunlight," he said. "I went to investigate later on and could find no apparent source from where it originated from. It actually interfered with filming," he said. However, this particular footage featuring the bright light has never been released to the public, and Hoffa would try to obtain it from the BBC, but without success. According to Hoffa, the children who saw the being described them as moving in slow motion like they were on the moon, and speculated there might have been an intense gravitational field created by the craft. He would also share different photos of his findings, and these photos would show a wedge-shaped impression in the rock-hard soil and an oval imprint in the grass, which had possibly been left by the supposed aircraft or spacecraft. This also helped to further cement and confirm the unique, similar individual stories from the 62 pupils that had witnessed the event on both September 15th and on September 16th of 1994, especially on September 16th when it was seen by more of them. It was an atmosphere where the kids had admitted to being scared, but somewhat full of excitement and confusion over what it could be. This newly unearthed photo evidence was shared online ahead of the release of the 2022 documentary called The Ariel Phenomenon, featuring the few interviews with the students about the astonishing incident, and now as adults, for them to tell their stories again without fear or stigma. It would be 20 years later, in 2015, when Emily returned to the school she attended as a little child, including the site of the landing. The stunning revelation also came as interest in UFOs, now known as UAPs, continues growing in the United States. Following the incident, an American Congress would pass a new law mandating a government UFO office to investigate such incidents. On Tuesday, 17th May 2022, so nearly 3 decades later, the Congressional Subcommittee for over 50 years would hold the first public hearings into an unidentified aerial phenomenon, known as UAP for short, which was prompted by the continued reports of incursions by strange and highly sophisticated craft in US airspace, including near aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons silos. Even nearly or over 30 years later, now adults, they have all stuck to their stories for decades, and in 2016, Emily, as an adult, would go for a talk where she exhibited paintings that she described as a manifestation of the messages she received from the beings that day. During the event, someone in the crowd would ask her if she's had further experiences with the beings, to which she said yes, but she doesn't know if they were still the same ones she saw as a child. Then she described her painting, saying that she doesn't know what she's going to paint when she starts painting. But she described the painting and talks about the energy that surrounds her when time seemed to freeze during the encounters with the strange creatures. Then someone would ask her to describe the beings from her other experiences, to which she says that these beings can alter perception to make you feel more comfortable with what you are saying. She would also say that in her last encounter, there were grays and a face that went back and forth between a being and a lion. She would also tell how the beings were like the ones she saw as a child. Emily would also state that it appeared to her as though some kind of energy had surrounded them during the encounter that appeared to stop time, but could not declare how certain the incident occurred for her, as it might even be that time for all intents and purposes did not exist as it does normally for, in particular for the children who witnessed the strange events that morning. Even though from the time of the break till the time they reported the incident, although an approximate time of 15 minutes had been reportedly given, And what is further interesting here is that although the incident, at least on the surface, is a close encounter with a UFO and the occupants, such details surface most often in alien abduction cases. Then the guy who was with Emily during the event would close the presentation by paraphrasing what she told him, saying, "Who cares what the ship looked like? Who cares what it sounded like? Who cares what they looked like? It's what they are saying to us," and seem to stand with him. What these beings who are somewhere watching and closely observing us humans, what they are trying to tell us is what really matters. And for these beings that seem so sophisticated and smarter, maybe we humans should act better so we can achieve greater things, make positive impacts, and leave the world to be a better place than we met it. Perhaps the lasting feeling of the area school UFO encounter is that whatever the strange craft and the even stranger figures that appeared from it might one day prove to be, it is almost certain that the children did see something that morning in September 1994. Even though not all the children at the school that day claimed they saw something, several of them still maintains that what they saw that morning was very real. Some of them who witnessed the strange black-clad figures close up further maintained that they will never forget it looking directly at them. Indeed, we can only imagine how many times these witnesses have awoken from dreams of that morning of the strange creatures they witnessed throughout not only their childhood, but as adults also. As for the witnesses themselves, it is interesting to know that even after all these years, now as adults, they still vividly remember that day and continue to stand by their stories. It was indeed a remarkable case in that all of these kids, across ages, cultural and ethnic divides, managed to give the same exact story and stick with it well into adulthood when the case had already come and gone into the public consciousness. Along with the intrepid research of Hind and Mark, both of whom expressed genuine intrigue and cited the believability of the accounts, it certainly seems to be an obscure report that is deserving of consideration, at least. No matter what happened on that day, the area school incident has remained a little known, but a very pervasive UFO account in African UFO lore and remains discussed to this day. Not just those in the fields of UFO research, but many with expertise in child behavior would claim it would be simply unrealistic that so many children at such a young age would be able to agree and stick to the same story, and do so for an extraordinary prolonged amount of time. In short, there appears to be little doubt that the children themselves were completely honest in their telling of the events of that morning, and they remain so today as adults. Whether this encounter was one that was planned or not, we should note once more that these same telepathic messages which was received by the witnesses that morning are always the same that shows up in multiple cases of alien abduction and close contact. Ones that revolve around the misuse of technology and the damage happening to the planet, and ones that need to be addressed.